Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's learning session, Climate, Biodiversity, and Reduced Impact Logging in the Peruvian Amazon. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Emmeline Gasparini, and I'm a communications specialist with the Forest and Climate team here at WWF. And our presenters today are Dr. Rosa Goodman of Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, Vanya Tejeda of WWF Peru, and Karen Moe, also of WWF US. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and some frequently asked questions. So for those of you who have participated in past sessions, this will sound familiar. But yes, today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To get to the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate. We have two audio options. You can listen through your computer or dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. And it's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening through your computer, those are sometimes caused by having too many browser windows or programs open at once. And so feel free to close some of them, which usually solves the issue, or you're also always welcome to join by phone. And if you continue to have technical difficulties, please send me a message and I'll try to get you sorted out as quickly as possible. Along those lines, questions are absolutely welcome. You can send your questions anytime during the webinar using the toolbar on your screen. We'll answer as many as possible during our allotted time. After the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email with additional forest and climate resources from WWF and our presenters, including a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch a recording of the session once it's live, which is usually within about 24 hours or so. So thank you again for joining us, and with that, we'll get started. Karen, if you're connected to audio, would you like to take us to the next bit?
Yes. Hi, Emmeline. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Thanks everyone for joining. I just wanted to give a brief intro. So as some of you may know, sustainable forest management, particularly the management of natural forests for the timber production, is an important part of WWF's forest conservation strategy. And for the last 5 years or so, we have been collaborating with universities, research institutions to better understand the impact of logging in different biomes, and to also tease out the areas where we can improve management practices to better deliver the social and ecological benefits. So the two studies that you'll be hearing today are part of that effort, which looks at the climate and the biodiversity respectively. So we're really looking forward to future collaboration opportunities as well as the discussions following on this webinar. And without further ado, I will hand the mic over to our presenters.
All right, you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my name is Rosa Goodman. I'm sitting up here in Umeå, Sweden, and it's already snowy, so I miss Peru. Anyway, the work I'm going to present today is on reduced impact logging for climate change mitigation, which we put out largely coordinated through the Nature Conservancy. We put out a special issue in Forest Ecology and Management on reduced impact logging. So, oh, this is slow. So I led the Peru study. I'm sorry, this is very slow. Okay, so I led the Peru study, and then we put all 7 countries together in a pan-tropical review on the potential for reduced impact logging to reduce emissions from tropical forests, managed or logged tropical forests. So just a little background, probably most people on this call are familiar with the connection between forestry, carbon, and climate. But just if you aren't, so about 20% or more of the remaining tropical forests are selectively logged, and degradation accounts for 1/4 to over 2/3 of forest emissions from tropical countries. So that includes the emissions from deforestation, and you can see the wide range indicates how difficult it is to quantify. But just looking at degradation, selective logging is estimated to emit over half of those degradation emissions. So if we look at reduced impact logging, or RIL, as we often refer to it, it's a set of improved timber harvesting guidelines for selectively logged natural forests. And it's been around since the 90s with, I would say, mixed success and limited implementation. But it has a lot of goals, but we focus on RIL-C, as we call it, or climate effective reduced impact logging, and it's a subset of reduced impact logging practices to reduce carbon emissions specifically. So as I said, this study, coordinated study, took place in 7 countries, but we're going to focus on the Madre de Dios study in Peru. So it's in the southwestern Amazon, and we measured 9 annual cutting blocks. 5 of those are from concessions certified by the Forest Stewardship Council, FSC, and we regarded those as trained in reduced impact logging. And then 4 cutting blocks were from non-certified concessions, and we considered those not trained in reduced impact logging. So the purpose of this study was not to evaluate the effectiveness of certification, but rather to quantify the carbon impact of selective logging and determine the potential to reduce emissions through reduced impact logging practices. So before I get started, I want to mention a few things that are unique about Madre de Dios. The first thing is that this map region, which is Madre de Dios, Peru, Acre, Brazil, and Pando, Bolivia, are a hotspot for deforestation, especially since the interoceanic highway has been paved and completed several years ago now. It's also a hotspot for biodiversity, so then it's also quite important for conservation. So we have really conflicting land use going on in this area. So forestry concessions are fairly prominent in Madre de Dios, and they have quite low harvest intensities, much lower than other parts of the world. So typically less than 10 cubic meters per hectare. And something really interesting that came out in this study is that on average, the concessions harvest about half of the government authorized volumes, so it could be much more intense. There's also a very high prominence of FSC certified concessions in this region. WWF has a strong presence there, and I believe has helped a lot of concessions get certified. One key thing that we noticed was that the FSC concessions were much larger in size, which I think makes sense because it's quite expensive and time-consuming process, so only the larger ones can do it. And then as far as the forest and ecology go, they're often classified as these open bamboo-dominated forests. And I put bamboo dominated in quotes because they're often classified as that, but I believe that they're tree dominated with the presence of bamboo in some places. But they definitely are more open, and the tree architecture corresponds to that. So they have much larger crowns than other parts of the Amazon and tropics, and a very high proportion of their biomass in branches. And correspondingly, they have relatively short stems. So I did my doctoral work in this region, weighing trees and making new allometric equations. And because they have these huge crowns and short stems, I was convinced that they were that these forests would be very inefficient to log because there would be a lot of damage during the fall, a lot of wasted wood left in the branches in the forest, and then not very much timber harvested in the stems. But we'll come back to that later when we see the results. So just very quickly, I want to show you what we did. So we tracked direct impacts of logging from 6 sources. So as you can see, from skid trails, from roads, and from log yards. And then collateral damage from felling. So this is everything that was killed when the tree fell. So smaller trees or even larger trees, sometimes whole trees, sometimes branches. And then the felled tree remainders, or as I sometimes call them, the crop tree residuals. So that would be the butt log, these buttresses, and of course all the branches. And then the timber extracted as well. So if we, just very briefly on the data processing, we calculated all these as committed emissions. And so we have tons of carbon or megagrams of carbon. We calculate that per hectare, per cubic meter of extracted timber, and then ton per ton. So multiplying the volume times wood density gives us the mass of extracted timber. And then we calculate this carbon impact factor, which is this last one, so ton per ton, but excluding the extracted timber. So it's sort of the unintended carbon losses from the forest. And you can look at that as the wood killed, the ratio of wood killed to wood harvested. So moving into the results, we can see that, so this is the carbon impact factor plus the extracted log, which is by definition 1, per each of these 9 concessions. And there are a number of things you can note here. So one is that the FSC concessions all had lower harvest intensities than the other, than the non-certified concessions, and that's not required, but it's often observed. So per hectare, the certified concessions have lower emissions, but when you scale it to the volume extracted, you can see that there's no difference. In fact, there's very little difference in any of the concessions except one of them has a bit higher emissions. And then if we compare this to other tropical countries, this is the very interesting part here. It comes up. Okay, so you can see here circled in orange that Peru is on, or Madre de Dios specifically, is on the very low end of harvest intensities. And also this trend that you see in other countries where the carbon impact factor declines as harvest intensity increases is not seen in Peru. It's pretty flat along the entire range of wood densities. The other thing now, if we take the mean from each of the 7 countries we studied, you see that Madre de Dios has the absolute lowest emissions per ton of timber extracted. So my theory from my thesis was completely wrong. But what is true is that the largest contributor to unintended emissions are the felled tree remainders, so all the branches and the butt logs and buttresses that are left in the forest. And the roads are very, very small contribution in Madre de Dios compared to these countries that have the highest emissions. So if we go back to Madre de Dios now, and we're looking at the potential emissions reductions. What we did here is we looked at the minimum observation in each of those 6 sources of emissions and selected the minimum. So just to show you what we did, so for example, we selected the value for residuals, the crop tree residuals from this concession, collateral damage from that concession, and the real practices that contribute to this: improved bucking and log recovery, so certainly not abandoning logs in the forest. For collateral damage, we have directional felling. Skidding, we can see we took from this concession, and so that includes skid trail planning, and the skidding equipment is actually quite important. And then finally, the roads. They're very narrow haul roads in Madre de Dios, and I wouldn't say that it's necessarily desirable to have them really narrow because you do want the sun to hit them and dry. But this does look like a strong point in Madre de Dios is having quite narrow roads. So if we sum all those up just to show you the level 1 potential emissions reductions, those are all the minimum observed values that I just showed you. But if we go back to the baseline carbon impact factor was 3.04, which means that over 3 times more carbon is lost from the forest than is removed. And as I said before, most of that, more than everything else put together, are the crop tree residuals. So over 50% there. 20% from collateral damage, 15% from skid trails, and 11% from the roads. So again, if we take the minimum observed, so this is everything that should be possible with the current technology and practices, we could reduce the unintended emissions by almost half. And then if we move to theoretical improvements beyond that, we could have a tiny bit of reduction. So practices that would reduce even further would be liana cutting 6 months prior to felling. And this would reduce collateral damage because the Lianas often connect branches, and so it can pull down more branches when the felled tree is down, but also really improves worker safety. We also looked at what would happen if there's cable winching for the last 30 meters of skid trails. But the most important thing, and is if you look at these numbers here, almost all of the potential emissions come in reducing the crop tree residuals, so increasing log recovery there. Here we estimated an increase in 10%, but I believe it could be much larger, especially if we use the branches, the branch wood. So then I did another analysis on, well, what if we didn't cut any trees with any hollow section? And you can see that the carbon impact factor actually goes up because the relative emissions from roads increases because we're decreasing the amount of timber harvested by quite a lot. And there's virtually no difference in any other source you can see between this scenario and the baseline. So what I think is that in Peru, they're actually doing a lot of things right. So they must be doing plunge cuts to check for any hollowness and then having quite good discretion in felling. So only felling the trees where you can still get a significant amount of wood out of it. Also, I think that they have excellent recovery of felled trees. In this whole study, only 4 logs were abandoned. The haul roads are quite narrow, as you could see from the pan-tropical study. The fewest emissions from any country, even though the harvest intensities were quite low. And then directional felling seems to be quite good. So looking for some evidence of further improvements, we can see that the FSC concessions did have a slightly higher timber recovery. So this is the mass of extracted log compared to the biomass of the crop tree. So they must be doing something, having a slight bit of improved bucking there. And again, I think that it could be even more. The other thing is that beyond carbon, the FSC concessions damaged fewer future crop trees during felling. So the certified concessions had 0.6 future crop trees damaged per felled tree, and the non-certified concessions had over twice that. And the carbon emissions were 16% less, even though they were not significantly different. So those were the results, but moving forward, I think what really stands out here is looking for actual effectiveness. So what we see in this study is that training does not translate towards implementation or effectiveness. In this region, there's quite a low retention of skilled workers. Typically what happens is workers are brought from other parts of the country. They come for one season, they find out they can make a lot more money in gold mining and leave. So all that capacity is lost. And I really think that to improve the effectiveness, we need to look at improving the living and working conditions for the workers and also incentives. And then one note is that the managers have quite a power to create the camp culture. They can give talks in the morning and in the evenings about safety, about sustainability. And so to let the workers know that that this is actually valued and important. And then my final points, so moving towards sustainability out of just reducing carbon emissions. But another thing that stands out is that reduced impact logging nor certification equals sustainability. And the sustainability of timber yields is, I would say, quite iffy in tropical forests. But I dug into the literature, and interestingly, so in the concessions in Madre de Dios that we studied, only 3 to 9% of the forest biomass was lost. And if you look into meta-analyses, if there's less than 10% loss, then the carbon stock should recover within 20 years. So that's encouraging, but again, carbon stock recovery does not equal sustainable timber yields. I looked into harvest intensities, and the harvest intensities in Peru are actually less than recommendations in Brazil and Guyana for sustainable harvests, but the rotation lengths might not be long enough. Another thing that I would say is quite troubling is the very high dependency on a single species in this region. It's locally known as Chihuahuaco. It's a dipteric species. It's very dense and valuable wood, but they're cutting, several 100-year-old trees, and in 20 years, we won't have the same recovery. So now, just a plug for my future work, I do believe that it's time to transform the tropical timber industry, which includes the wood processing and markets, which would make sustainable forest management possible. So with that, thank you very much, and we can move on to the next panelist, Vanya.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Rosa. Well, my name is Vanya Tejeda. I am from Peru, from the office of WWF Peru. Well, I'm going to present this little research that we did together with WWF USA Chief Analytics from Puerto Rico. Is how does FSCC forest certification affect the acoustically active fauna in Madre de Dios, Peru? Sorry for my English. If you don't understand parts of what I'm going to talk, just let me know at the end of the presentation. Thank you. Well, we did all this study in the same region of Peru, Tawamano. So this Tawamano forest is, like Rosa said, a difficult kind of bamboo-dominated forest, because it's not like a common forest. Tropical forest is dominated by bamboo, but also have big trees, and it's a mix of vegetation. Our study is in a place where it's a hotspot of biodiversity, and just in birds, we have more than 1,800 birds species. And there is a lack of information about how the fauna responds to forest management certification. Also, there is a very active region for forestry concessions. Just they comprise around 14% of Peruvian Amazon, and in Madre de Dios, it comprises about 1,216,000 hectares. And now our study, there's no studies just directly assessed to the impacts of forest certification. So at the community level, using acoustics. So this part of the study is very important, because we are not using traditional methods. We are using a little of technology to improve, or maybe to assess this kind of monitoring in birds. Next, please. And well, here I can show you the study site. You can see the plots. The yellow ones are the FSCC blocks. The no FSCC are the sky blue blocks, and the control, who are the places where there is no activity of logging. They're the orange. And we have in total 68 stations with a record there. And our record displays were in 60 sites, divided in 24 FSC certified management sites, 23 reference sites, or the control, and 20 not FSCC certified managed sites. And we record 1 minute of audio every 10 minutes for a total of 144 minutes. So you can imagine how much information we have for our recorder, and we have to multiply this information for 67 sites. Next, please. So our objective, or our pursuit of this research, is to evaluate the impact of forest certification on the fauna, because we have a lot of information about how it works, dynamics in forests, but we don't have information about how is the response of fauna. So we choose like a study group, birds, because birds are the more sensitive to little change, or to change in the structure on vegetation. So we use PAM, passive acoustic monitoring, to acquire data and document the response of acoustically active fauna to trees forest management in three kinds. And specifically, our question was how soundscapes compositions and space acoustic usage vary among the three forest management types. And the other question was how the bird community differs among the three forest management types. Next, please. Next slide. Okay. Our methods include three parts: analyze soundscapes, analyze bird species, and also correlate these planetary variables like latitude, longitude, forest management type, distance to roads in meters, distance to rivers, years since logging, two forest structure variables with using ALOS and Sentinel, and calculate as a change over the time between specific years and two canopy heterogeneity variables. So I'm going to abord this part, each one talking about a little bit why we decide to use soundscapes or bit disperses richness to find a relation. Next, please. Our data collection was a huge work because we have to access to different kind of parts in all these concessions. And this Tahuamanu forest was a little tricky because field work presents in that season some logistic issues like rain, or sometimes it's a very dry forest, so you can find water, and we have to walk a lot of kilometers to set up these recorders. And well, we divide in between groups and we mobilize in these trucks. We set up these acoustic recorders every 2 kilometers. So as you see in the map, all of them are inside the blocks of treatment. Next, please. Our data processing, well, the variables all were standardized because we need to correlate with the information that we have. So as I told you before, we use distance to roads. So in that way, this variable could be important to find a relation between the sound or the species detection and the activity in the road, no? And also this correlate with soundscape because we create 67 sites and the soundscape analysis was using the tool of Arimon. Arimon is a software in our platform where you can put all the information and you can process all the information in range of 24 hours, and you can see the frequencies that we're using now. So this procedure includes creating a playlist for each site with a 1 minute of recordings from 7 consecutive days in a scale time of 24 hours. I mean, we are using all the sounds of all the day, using a frequency band size of 172 Hertz and an amplitude filtering threshold of 0.003 acoustic space used. As the percent of time and frequency bins used of each site of 24 hours and the bins of 3072 time frequency bins. So these parameters are important because in that way we can hear, we are sure that we are using all the frequencies here that we can hear in the landscape. And bird species richness is the composition of, and we did a manual inspection. Specialist ornithologists inspect all the first 3 consecutive days from 67 sites. So this analysis wasn't all automatic. In fact, we use artificial intelligence, but also there is a component of manual inspection because we corroborate each recording for the first consecutive days. So in that way, we can find the most of the species, and after that, we analyze the next recordings that we didn't hear before using these identifications doing previously. Next, please. So as I told you, using artificial intelligence to identify species was a way to improve our time and also to be sure that the species that we are hearing are the correct ones, because, for example, you can see in the image the identification species, the vocalization pattern, and we use the principal pattern of the species. I mean, birds have many kind of songs or calls. They differ between females, juveniles, and males, but there is a principal song that most of the ornithologists or bee watchers used to know. And also we use that pattern. And that pattern is unique. It's like a footprint, no? Fingerprint, sorry. Because we can see the pattern and it's not going to be the same for the other species. So that led us to make difference between them. And it's a kind of identification. So each pattern have a special frequency, and we can see that it's going to be very useful because this is a basis to elaborate acoustic models. These acoustic models are going to allow us to elaborate standardized models for each species and to analyze all the information that we didn't hear before of the thousands of minutes that we have. So in that way, we improve our time, and we are not just sitting in the office listening all the recordings. So it's a good way to do it, but also it's very hard work, because you have to spend a lot of time identifying all the patterns, these species, and also this method allow us to validate after the study the information. For example, if I have a mistake identifying a similar species for the vocal pattern, I can later ask other persons and validate or maybe correct if we have a bad identification. Next, please. Our results, soundscapes. Soundscapes is a way to interpret the richness or the biodiversity of a place using the parameters as acoustic space used. Now, so our ASU vary between 18 and 40% for each site, for the 67 sites. So this is a visual representation of soundscape for a sample of the 3 forest management types. So the axis represent the x-axis, frequency, the y, and the proportion of the observation zeta. The figures includes 3072 time frequency bins, as I told you before, and the space acoustic usage was calculated by assuming the number of time and frequency birds that were occupied. I mean, there is no birds in all these sounds. It's a mix from birds, from frogs, insects, from another kind of noise. But we correlate the soundscape also because we analyze a small group like birds. So we know, like, for example, at the time of 7 or between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m., if we have a huge activity, is very correlated to vocalization of birds. So our ASU was significantly different among the 3 management types and was higher in the FSCC sites than the reference or non-FSCC groups. The majority of the time, frequency bins that contribute to these similarities between sites occurred at night and high frequency, more than 10 kilohertz. So this is very important because we are going to discuss later why what could significate or what we can interpret these results and why these similarities occurs at night. No. Next, please. Bird species richness and compositions. Well, we find here is this analysis told us that there is no significant difference detections among the tree management types. We use an ANOVA. So in total, we have 11,300 bird detections and 226 bird species. So this is using just acoustics, we can detect this kind of this number of birds, and I mean this is a very significant number because for the area, using not only some species or species that vocalize, we can find around 500 species of birds, but using just acoustic, we found more than the half. We did an NMDC coordination of the 70 sites based in all the frequency bands of each soundscape, and the circles represent the stand error of 25% around the strand center of the tree management site types. And as you can see in the bars in the right, the acoustic space used and the relation with each treatment and this box plot of the percent of acoustic space used among the three forest management types. So as you can see, there is 3 groups in 3 treatments, but there is not a significant difference about datations. Next, please. Next slide.
We can see it, Vanya. I think sometimes it's just a little slow to change on everyone's screen.
Okay. Sorry. Okay, well, what we can say at the end of this study and the method that we are using for measure biodiversity or the impact of activity like logging, where we figure out that acoustic monitoring can help us greatly to improve our ability to monitor population change in thousands of species, not only birds, but the ecological and conservation community has been a little slow in incorporating this technology in their monitoring and reach projects, because and also there exists a different panorama in the concept of monitoring species. For example, 20 years ago, it was a little impossible for a Latin American to buy camera traps to monitoring mammals. But right now, with the low cost and with different kind of equipments, we can say that this low cost, about $100, we can buy not only one camera, we can buy 100 cameras and we can improve our effort. It's the same with acoustics. One recorder used to worth around probably $600 or $800 each one, and now we can find recorders that you can buy one for $50. So this is not only a good option or a good tool to use or to monitor in species, but also is a cost-effective tool, and we can have more results that we can validate after, because each recording is like a voucher, similar to a museum collection, no? Because you can save this information not only for the soundscapes, like I showed you, you can also save this information to identify species or to validate species after you did the work. So we believe that acoustic monitoring can help to research and also can help to improve the methods and response probably question that we have around how the biodiversity could be affected by not only logging, but by another kind of activities made by humans. Next, please. Our contribution and next steps. Well, there is a panorama that we don't know how there is an unclear panorama because the soundscape ecology and the acoustic passive monitoring is starting, and it's very complicated right now in the tropics because in difference to other places like temperature places like Europe or Asia, no Asia, Australia or North America, the biodiversity is high. So at the same time it's complex because there is a lot of active acoustic fauna all the time. I mean, we have thousands of birds and frogs at the same time, and it's going to be a challenge to improve the method, to improve the analysis and of these recordings, because the analysis of these recordings provide one of the most detailed studies of the Amazon bird community. More than 200 species were detected here regarding the distribution and vocal activity patterns. So this is very important because we have a lack of information of biodiversity baseline in the Tawamanu area. And this is to help us to contribute the generation of information. Also, future studies should focus on the identification of insects and anurans, since these groups may exhibit less mobility than birds, and they may be better indicators. Like I told you before, we choose to work with birds because birds used to be very sensitive to smell change and structure change in vegetation. But also insects and anurans could be important, or they are important in the context of climate change or small change in vegetation also, or could be one of our explanation of our results. We found that the daily variation in acoustic activities can be further explored to characterize a site and assess the influence of human activities in animal behavior, because our results show us the difference in soundscapes between the treatments, but it wasn't, we believe it wasn't because the activity of the machines or the another kind of sound, because the different patterns we found was at night. So what space is used by night? They are used by insects and anurans, or most of the sounds are made for them. So our next question for trying to figure out this part of the research is to answer what happened with the insects or what happened with the anurans. Is the activity of the roads probably affecting the patterns of vocalization, or probably could be just the small change in the vegetation or the weather? So this is very important to focus for the next studies. And well, this is a kind of little pilot that we use here in Tawamanu Forest, because we have plans to monitoring, for example, monkeys or primates, that they're part important of this study. In this part we didn't analyze, but we have another research that we're doing right now with all the team. We focalize and correlate the hunting or with this kind of management logging in this area of Tawamanu, Madre de Dios. Next, please. Well, I think is the last slide. Well, thank you. If you have any more questions, just let us know.
Great. Thank you both, Rosa and Vanya. That's really interesting presentations. Participants, this is your time now to send specific questions in through the question function in the dashboard. So I have a few that I'm going to start off with, but this is your next 10 minutes. So please feel free to send your burning questions in, and I will ask them of our presenters. Our first question is for Rosa. Can you tell us the percentage that Dipteryx represented in the study that you mentioned? What percentage of carbon removed from the study area?
Yes, conveniently, I calculated this already. So the Dipteryx represented 55% of all the trees harvested, 72% of timber volumes, and 76% of carbon exported. So over 3/4 of carbon. And in one forest management unit, it was 98% of carbon extracted. So really high dependency on that one species.
Yeah, that's very significant. Our next question is sort of along, well, somewhat similar lines. This person is based in Acre, and they're saying that the previous increase in risks to accidents during harvesting and cutting have caused some people to argue that lianas should be cut by chainsaw before operators are cutting or felling the trees. Can you talk a little bit about how that factor may or may not have played into this particular project in your research?
That I'm a little bit confused. So they're saying that that cutting 6 months prior to the harvest, cutting the lianas 6 months prior to the harvest increased risk of accident during the timber cutting. Is that what it sounds?
That's my
Am I interpreting
interpretation of
that?
their question, yes.
Okay, I can't really comment on that. One of the things I can say is that pretty much nobody goes out 6 months in advance to cut the lianas. It's a recommendation for reduced impact logging, but to hike around the jungle to cut lianas 6 months in advance is really quite unfeasible. So there's very little research on it. I mean, that's a super interesting finding, and I can't really think of why that would increase risk if the lianas were dead, because the idea is that they die and fall off and then aren't holding so tightly to the other crowns. But I really can't say. I think that person should send us a comment or send it to Jack Putz. He would probably be interested.
Thank you. Yes, and if you would like to clarify the person who sent in that question, please feel free to do so. Oh, and I am muted. I'm so sorry. You mentioned the 3 to 8 meters cubed productivity. Is that within private concessions or also within community-based timber management?
So that is the average harvest logging intensity, not productivity. So productivity would be the potential for it to grow. But yes, it was 3 to 8 cubic meters per hectare in legal concessions. We did not study community-based timber management.
Okay, fantastic. Looks like we have a lot of comments. So if you have questions you would like our panelists to answer, please feel free to send them in. We have a few more minutes. While I'm waiting for your questions, I will convey some of these comments. One of our participants is in Guyana, and they said that when they were working in the Iwakwama Reserve, one of the things they did was have locals come into the area that was being inventoried to cut the lianas after a month or two, and then come back to harvest them after their use. So an interesting additional layer of use for the lianas within these concessions. Very interesting. Another, also from Guyana, is the option of cutting the lianas during the pre-harvest inventory, so along similar lines. So it looks like a lot of people very interested in how the lianas are playing into this cutting. I don't know, Rosa or Vanya, do you have any other comments along those lines?
The only thing I can say is that we did not explicitly test for the cutting of lianas in this study. And it's Anand Rupson is the lead author of another study in our pantropical analysis, so he would know. So his comments are quite valid. it is an option. We, in the concessions in Peru, none of them explicitly did this. So in the Peru context, I can't really comment, but it's a very interesting discussion.
Okay. Participants, last chance for questions to come in. Otherwise, I'll give you your last few minutes back. Here we go. So Rosa, can you tell us a little more about modified wood processing?
Okay, yes, thank you for that. So this is a whole new project I'm working on the timber processing facilities, and a large part of that is including, so the idea is that if you renovate the wood processing facilities and the market, that's the main thing, having integration across the value chain, and so that you can select species based on wood properties rather than just tradition, because right now only a very few species are harvested, and that's basically because, oh, people know mahogany, so they want mahogany. But if you have more communication between the buyer and producer, then you can select species based on wood properties, and then you can co-develop the products so that the cutting is more efficient and you cut to specification. And then the biggest thing is kiln drying on site. Basically, nobody does this in the tropics, which is really problematic. There's a lot of wood waste because wood rots, it warps, it cracks, so there's very inconsistent products, even when, you know, really conscientious people want to buy from like a nice, well-managed sawmill. If they're not getting a consistent product, then they won't. And the other thing is that there's a massive value added for that, so that people can make a lot more profit off of forestry operations. And then if you're making more profit, then you can implement better management, you have a more sustainable business, you can manage the forest more sustainably and long term. So I think that this whole transformation is necessary because the current rules and market are just not very conducive to sustainable forest management in the tropics.
Thank you. Our next question, so in Costa Rica, this participant says they've been testing LiDAR technologies using drones to assess biomass within managed forests and then therefore carbon stocks. Vanya, this question might be more for you, but Rosa, feel free to answer as well. Would you see this as a possibility to be explored in Madre de Dios within the area you've researched and linked to the parameters that you've based your research on? So what do you think the feasibility is of using drones to assess biomass within these forests and therefore, you know, make suppositions about the carbon stocks?
Well, I can have one comment. I mean, there has been a lot of remote sensing done in Madre de Dios, and even with LiDAR. It's always possible. It's harder to use LiDAR. I mean, it's good for change detection, so you can detect deforestation, but degradation or logging impacts are very difficult to measure from above.
Thanks, Rose. Vanya, did you want to weigh in?
Well, just a little thing is about, we thought when we were trying to figure out how correlate the vegetation to the species richness or the species we can find in this kind of area, because Tawamanu forest, especially in Tawamanu, no, in all Madre de Dios, Tawamanu is a very mixed forest, and so it was very difficult to quantify the bamboo. No, because if you use the satellite images, you can see the coverture, and probably you can know that it's a continuous forest, and you can say that there is a lot of vegetation, and you can measure and other things, but it's very difficult to quantify or to know how much bamboo is inside. So the only way it was doing just measurements inside, the forest. I mean, doing a plot and measure the vegetation structure, but the other option was to use drones. And in fact, we tried to do it, and but was later that we did the research. So after this experience, we know that it's a possibility in terms of microhabitat or small scales to use drones to quantify the vegetation using focalized for bamboo, because bamboo is very difficult, as I said, to quantify or to know or to detect in an image. So this, for me at least, or for my team, is an option to use it for respond or answer more questions around vegetation structure, and use these images to answer them.
Thank you. Very interesting. So we've come to the end of our questions, which is fortunate because we've also come to the end of our time today. So if we can go to the next slide, please. I really want to thank Rosa and Vanya for sharing your expertise with our community, and also thank the participants for joining us and sending in your really thoughtful and interesting comments and questions. You'll all receive a follow-up email in a few hours to some additional resources that are specific to this webinar, which include links to some of the papers that were presented here today. Next slide, please. And if you want to revisit this webinar or share it with a colleague, which you're always welcome to do, the recording will be up on the Forest and Climate YouTube channel within about a day or so. And you can also find the recordings of previous sessions there for additional enrichment. Next slide, please. Thank you all again for joining us, and we hope you have a great day. Bye.